The night was pitch black when that single light flickered on. It was the kind of silence that only exists after midnight, when even the wind seems to have gone to sleep. The only sounds were the slow but purposeful footsteps of a 70-year-old woman crossing the hardwood floor of an office she knew better than its own owner. She took a deep breath, not out of exhaustion, but with the steady resolve of someone about to leap off a cliff. With intent. She placed the brown leather briefcase on the desk without saying a word. She let its weight do the talking first. The man on the other side, his suit rumpled and eyes still clouded with sleep, looked at her as if she were a minor inconvenience. It was only when she opened her mouth that he realized there was nothing minor about this moment. "You kicked me out to bring your mistress into my home." Her voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "Now sign the paper that strips you of everything. And don't bother crying. I won't have any mercy." He opened the briefcase, and when his eyes hit the logo printed on the first page, the blood drained from his face like water from an open faucet. It was the symbol of his own company. The company he swore was his. But to understand what that moment meant, we have to go back. We have to go back decades to where it all began, to where a simple woman planted, with her own two hands, every inch of what this man once called his own. Lucille's alarm went off at 5 in the morning. Not because anyone ordered her to, not because there were employees who needed supervision at that hour, but because that's who she was. That's how she had always been, since before she had a mansion, since before she had anything but sheer will and a husband with a dream far too big for his wallet at the time. She would walk down the stairs with her hair still loose, wearing those rubber flip-flops she refused to throw away, and head straight for the kitchen. She brewed coffee using a cloth filter, the same way her mother did, the same way her grandmother did. The scent spread through the marble hallways like a living contradiction, that simple, honest aroma trapped inside a house that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. And that was Lucille's contradiction. The house was a mansion, yes, 6 bedrooms, a heated pool, a garden with stone sculptures that an architect charged the price of a condo to design. But Lucille wasn't born rich. She was rich because she was stubborn. Rich because she worked when no one else would bet on them. Because she held the hand of an insecure husband during the years when the company was nothing more than a rented room with a leaky ceiling and 2 employees who sometimes went unpaid because the bank account was in the red. She was the silent builder of it all. While the coffee brewed, she would walk down the hall and fold Robert's shirt with the care of someone handling something precious. She liked doing it, or at least she had liked it for many years, a ritual of love she could no longer distinguish from habit. After coffee, she would head to the backyard garden, where she grew tomatoes, basil, and a rose bush that Robert had never even noticed. There, among the plants damp with morning dew, Lucille felt more like herself than anywhere else in that massive house. Robert woke up at 8. He didn't just walk down to the kitchen. He appeared in the theatrical sense of the word, as if the staircase itself were a stage prepared for him. Always impeccably dressed, every hair in place, always wearing that imported cologne Lucille once thought was elegant, but had eventually learned to associate with hollow vanity. He was a man who loved mirrors. There was one in the foyer, one in the second-floor hallway, one in the private gym he'd installed in the guest suite. Not because working out was a necessity, but because he loved seeing his own reflection while lifting weights, as if he needed constant confirmation that he existed, and that he existed well. At the company, the cult of self was even more evident. He had built that business, it was true, but he built it like a conductor who takes credit for the entire orchestra without ever touching an instrument. Lucille was the one who played the instruments. She was the one who convinced the first investor when Robert couldn't finish a sentence without stuttering. She was the one who spent nights reviewing contracts while he was in meetings she would later come to understand for what they truly were. At the office, everyone knew who Robert was. Few knew who Lucille was, and that was exactly how he preferred it. It was at a board lunch, 2 years before everything changed, that Carla first appeared. 32 years old, a degree in business administration, and the kind of confidence people often mistake for competence. She started as an executive assistant, but it soon became clear that her role went far beyond what her contract described. She wore designer clothes that turned heads in meetings. She knew Robert's tastes in a way you only learn through proximity. And when she was present at company events, there was something in their body language. A gaze held a second too long, a suppressed smile that anyone paying attention could read. Lucille was paying attention. She said nothing for a while, not because she was naive, but because she had known Robert for 3 decades. And she waited, with the patience only years can teach, hoping she was wrong. Hoping it was just her own insecurity, exhaustion, or the loneliness of sleeping beside someone who had long since stopped seeing her. But the night of the dinner party stripped away any remaining doubt. It was a business dinner at their home. Robert had invited 3 partners and their spouses, a corporate lawyer, and of course Carla, who was introduced as indispensable for tomorrow's meeting, with a casualness that hurt more than any direct insult. Lucille welcomed the guests as she always did, with the quiet, genuine hospitality of someone who knows how to host without needing to be the center of the room. She had asked the chef to prepare Robert's favorite dish, and before everyone arrived, she had set the table with flowers she had picked from her own garden. Carla arrived wearing red. During dinner, the 2 of them traded comments about company strategy, as if the other guests were an audience and Lucille were merely part of the decor. And then, as Lucille stood up to get dessert, a wine glass spilled onto her floral dress. Silence. Carla put her hand over her mouth with an expression of horror that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh my God, how clumsy of me. Please forgive me." Everyone looked at Lucille. Then they looked at Robert. And Robert, the man Lucille had supported, defended, and loved for decades, looked at his own wife with wine dripping down her dress and said, with a coldness that sliced through the air like a knife, "Lucille, for heaven's sake, you're always so clumsy." She didn't answer. She went to the bathroom, washed what she could, and returned to the table with a serene face. But inside her, something that was already cracked simply stopped trying to hold itself together. The next morning, Robert was sitting at the kitchen table when she came down. A folder of papers sat in front of him. He didn't even wait for her to pour the coffee. "I'm going to need you to sign this." She looked at the documents. A divorce petition. Already drafted by a lawyer, already dated, already outlining the terms he had decided on his own. "Lucille," he said, in the tone one uses to explain something to a child, "you're a good person, but you don't have the class a woman in my position needs to have. You're never going to fit into the world I have to live in." She remained silent for a long moment. She looked at him. She looked at the kitchen where she had handpicked every detail. She looked out the window at the garden and the rosebush he had never noticed. "Fine, Robert," she said, "just that." That same afternoon, a black trash bag was left by the front door, with her clothes inside, with her rubber flip-flops, with a photo of the garden she had framed and hung in the hallway. The photo that had also vanished from the wall as if it had never been there. It was raining when she left. She didn't cry. She picked up the bag, walked to the gate, and before latching it for the last time, she looked back just once. At the mansion she had helped build brick by brick, at the glowing windows where Carla's shadow could already be seen moving with the familiarity of someone who already knew the rooms. And there, in the rain, at 62 years old with a trash bag in her hand, Lucille made a decision. She wasn't leaving defeated. She was leaving with a plan. The room at the boarding house was the size of a sigh. A bed with a mattress far too thin, a window that wouldn't close right, a light bulb that flickered whenever the wind hit the pole outside. The bathroom was shared with 4 other rooms down the hall, and the smell of mildew had settled into the walls with the permanence of something that had no intention of leaving. Lucille stood in the doorway for a moment, the black trash bag on the floor by her feet, staring at a space that could fit entirely inside the dining room of the mansion she had left behind that very day. Then she took a deep breath, stepped inside, and closed the door gently. She wouldn't allow herself to crumble, not yet. During the first few days, she organized what she had with her usual meticulousness. She folded her clothes, placed the one photo she had managed to save on the nightstand, and scrubbed the walls of the room with a damp cloth as far as her arms could reach. It wasn't much, but it was what she had, and she had learned long before the mansion that dignity doesn't live in a space. It lives in a gesture. The money she had was whatever was in her purse that day, barely $60. Robert had made sure his lawyer was good, and the lawyer had indeed been good. Good for Robert. The papers she had signed, on that afternoon when she was still too stunned to read every clause carefully, left her with a pittance of temporary alimony while the case proceeded. The mansion, the cars, the accounts, everything was shielded in holdings and legal structures that would take years to unravel, if they could be unraveled at all. She needed to work. Lucille woke up the next day at 5 in the morning, out of habit, and realized there was no coffee to brew. She bought a cup at the corner bakery with coins she counted in her palm, folded the classified section the landlord had left in the hallway, and started reading. The first few calls were optimistic. She introduced herself with a firm voice, gave her name, said she was available immediately. The first question was always the same. What was your last professional experience? And there was the abyss. She had dedicated 30 years to the company. She had negotiated with suppliers, resolved crises, and kept the administrative structure running during the years when Robert still didn't know the difference between cash flow and gross revenue. But none of that was on a formal payroll. None of that was registered under her name. She was a wife, and wife in the vocabulary of HR forms meant absent from the market. Do you have any formal employment record from the last 10 years? No. Do you have any recent certifications? No. Unfortunately, your profile doesn't fit what we're looking for at the moment. She listened to those phrases with the patience of someone who had waded through worse, said thank you, and dialed the next number. But at night, after the hallway of the boarding house went quiet and the light bulb stopped flickering, she would sit on the edge of the bed and let the tears come. Slowly, without drama, like a dripping faucet. She wasn't crying out of self-pity. She was crying out of rage. At the injustice of having built so much and carrying so little on her resume. She wiped her face with the corner of the sheet, lay down, and set her alarm for 5 in the morning. It was on one of those cold nights, after a week of rejections, that she went out to buy medicine for a throat that had been scratchy since the afternoon. The rain caught her on the way back, one of those sudden downpours that gives no warning, soaking everything right through to the skin. She ran as fast as she could, which wasn't very fast, and made it back to her room drenched. She didn't think much of it. She'd been through worse. 3 days later, she could barely stand up. The fever arrived quietly and stayed. Her chest ached with every breath, a dull pain that spread across her back and tightened when she tried to speak. She recognized the weight of it, the labored breathing, the cold that wouldn't leave even under the blankets. Pneumonia. She had seen her mother suffer through it once, decades ago. The private hospital was 6 blocks away. She went to the reception desk with her ID and the $60 she had left, and the clerk barely looked at her before stating the cost of the consultation. It was more than she had. She asked if there was any insurance, any discount, any way. There wasn't. She walked to the public health clinic with shallow breaths and feet still soaked from the rain days before. The line already snaked down the hallway when she arrived. She took a number, sat on a hard plastic chair, and waited. She waited with a fever, with a chest that burned, with a heavy head, surrounded by others who were also waiting, each with their own burden, each invisible to the world outside. It took 6 hours before they called her name. The doctor was young, exhausted, and as kind as he could be. He confirmed the pneumonia, prescribed antibiotics, and told her she needed rest and nutrition. She didn't tell him that rest meant a room in a boarding house with a window that wouldn't close. She thanked him, took the prescription, and left. The days that followed were the hardest. She stayed alone in that room, the fever rising and falling like the tide, with no one to bring her soup, no one to ask if she was okay. The landlord knocked on the door once to collect the week's rent. She paid without complaining. When the door closed, she stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the silence of the hallway, and for the first time since leaving the mansion, she felt the full weight of loneliness. It wasn't sadness. It was something more physical than that. It was the absence of a human voice directed at her. It was the realization that she could go days without anyone noticing if she was well or dead. It was being 62 years old and completely alone in a room that smelled of mold, with pneumonia, with no money, and with no one to call. She thought of her children. Both had taken Robert's side without much resistance, each with their own reasons, each with their own convenient narrative. She had tried to call once. The call went unanswered. She placed the phone face down on the bed and closed her eyes. But Lucille wasn't the type to stay down. 3 weeks later, when the fever had finally vanished and her breathing had returned to normal, she folded her blankets, put on her rubber flip-flops, and went out to look for work again. This time, she changed her strategy. She stopped calling companies that required forms and certifications. She started walking the streets of the neighborhood, entering local businesses, talking eye to eye. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that she pushed open the door of a sewing shop at the back of a quiet street, with a faded sign in the window that read, "Seamstress wanted, experience required." The owner of the shop was a woman in her late 50s with short black hair, who looked her up and down with that quick, sharp gaze of someone who judges fabric by its texture. "Can you sew?" "Since I was 12, Lucille replied. The owner pointed to a machine in the corner and said simply, "Then show me." Lucille sat down, threaded the machine with a dexterity that hadn't faded in 30 years, and sewed a straight hem, then a curve, then a precise zigzag. Her hands remembered what circumstances had tried to make her forget. "You can start tomorrow," the owner said, and she went back to her work without further ceremony. The pay was humble, but it was a paycheck. And it was a space where she was valued for what she produced, not for her age or for the years she had spent away from a formal contract. It was at the shop that she met Maya. 23 years old, curly hair tied up high, headphones hanging around her neck like a necklace. She was an apprentice, quick with her fingers but impatient with her mistakes, the type who would throw the fabric on the bench when the thread snapped and need to take a deep breath before starting over. Lucille observed her for 2 days without saying a word. On the third day, when Maya was about to give up on a difficult neckline, Lucille pulled up a chair, sat beside her, and said, "Let me show you something." Maya looked at her with that mix of youthful skepticism and genuine curiosity. But she stayed quiet and watched, and when she saw the fabric take the right shape in Lucille's hands, she smiled for the first time since Lucille had arrived at the shop. From then on, they built a friendship at the slow and solid pace of true things. Maya would bring snacks for both of them during breaks, telling stories about her family with that energy of someone who still has the whole world ahead of them. And Lucille would listen, sometimes sharing a bit of her own past, just enough for Maya to piece together the fragments of the larger story without Lucille having to tell it all at once. One afternoon, while the two were sewing side by side with the fan spinning slowly over them, Maya asked, without looking away from the fabric, "Don't you get angry after everything that happened to you?" Lucille kept sewing for a moment. "I do," she said. "But anger without direction is wasted energy. I had to learn how to aim mine." The news came by chance, the way news that changes everything usually does. It was a Wednesday afternoon during a break at the shop. Maya was flipping through the business section of an old magazine someone had left on the bench by the entrance. She wasn't reading closely, just killing time, until Lucille's eyes, sitting beside her with a cup of coffee, landed on a small photo in the bottom corner of a page. It was Robert. He was in a photo from a corporate event. The same smile as always, the same suit. But there was something different in the image that Lucille recognized before even reading the caption. It was his neck. Robert was smiling, but his neck was tense the way it gets when the jaw is clenched tight beneath the surface. She had seen that tension for 3 decades. She knew what it meant. She asked Maya for the magazine without explaining, and took it home that night. She read every line twice. The report was discreet, the kind of journalistic text that says a lot while trying to say very little. It spoke of corporate restructuring, a liquidity move, and strategic portfolio adjustment. These were words used by people who had learned to dress reality in formal attire. But Lucille had spent years beside an entrepreneur. She had sat in meetings where those terms were used. She had learned the lingua franca of the boardroom by osmosis. She translated it for what it actually was. The company was desperately selling shares to pay off debts. She sat quietly for a long time in that small room, the magazine folded on her lap and the light bulb flickering above as if it too were trying to think. She knew that company better than anyone alive. She knew where the oldest contracts were, the ones that guaranteed preferential supply with margins no competitor could replicate. She knew which clients were anchors and which were just volume. She knew there was a logistics warehouse in the suburbs that was worth 3 times what was recorded on the balance sheet, because Robert had never bothered to get an updated appraisal, something she had asked for twice, and he had dismissed with that wave of his hand he used for matters that didn't interest him. She knew everything, and Robert had discarded all of that along with her in that black trash bag. In the following days, she began to observe more closely. She asked Maya to teach her how to better use her phone to access business news portals, something she had done for years on the mansion's computer but never on a phone. Maya taught her without asking why, with that natural generosity of someone who helps without needing to understand the reason. What Lucille discovered, news item by news item, was the architecture of a disaster she had predicted without meaning to. Carla had arrived at the company not just as a mistress, but as a presence that took up space. She had assumed roles that were once informally Lucille's, making decisions on contracts she didn't understand, and forming partnerships based on vanity rather than viability. She had hired a PR agency to redesign the company's brand identity, spending what would take 2 years of operating profit to recover. She had approved a new office at a premium address with rent that consumed what used to go toward reinvestment. And Robert, who had always needed someone to keep his feet on the ground when he flew too high, had found in Carla someone who flew even higher, and without any sense of altitude. The two of them together were the most expensive combination possible. Limitless arrogance and money that was running out. It was on a Saturday afternoon, while Lucille and Maya were having coffee after work, that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. Maya was talking about her father. He was an accountant who had been a partner in a small brokerage firm for years before retiring. He knew the markets with the intimacy of someone who had spent their whole life inside them. She spoke of him with admiration mixed with the natural impatience of a daughter, describing a meticulous, cautious man who kept labeled folders of documents for every year since 1986. Lucille listened with more attention than Maya realized. "Does he still follow the market?" Lucille asked with the casualness of someone asking about the weather. "Every day," Maya replied. "It's his addiction. He sits there with charts on his tablet like he's still on the clock." Lucille was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to meet him one day if you don't mind." Maya smiled with that 23-year-old spontaneity. "He'd love that. He hasn't had anyone to talk business with in ages." The meeting happened on a Sunday, on the porch of Maya's house, with coffee brewed the same way Lucille did, and a plate of warm biscuits that still smelled of the oven. Arthur was 71 years old, wore thick-rimmed glasses, had hands that had filled out forms for decades, and a mind that followed every line of Lucille's reasoning with the precision of a watchmaker examining a mechanism. She didn't beat around the bush. She told him everything. Who she was, what she had built, what she had lost, what she had discovered about the company, and the state it was in now. She told him about the contracts she knew, about the undervalued warehouse, about the anchor clients who were likely dissatisfied with the new management because anchor clients always notice when the attention they used to get starts being diverted elsewhere. Mr. Arthur listened without interrupting. Every now and then he adjusted his glasses. Every now and then he made a small note on the corner of a paper napkin with a pen he pulled from his shirt pocket. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to buy the shares in my name," he said. It wasn't a question. "In small batches," Lucille replied. "Spread out over months. Nothing that draws attention. Nothing that sets off an alarm. With your money. With what I can pull together. And with what the warehouse is worth once I get the appraisal done." She had discovered, through a lawyer recommended by a customer at the sewing shop, that there was a possible line of credit using the property rights she still held in the divorce proceedings as collateral. Small, but enough to start. Mr. Arthur looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter, who was sitting at the corner of the porch pretending not to be eavesdropping on everything. "You realize," he said slowly, "that this might not work, that you could lose the little you have left?" "I do," Lucille replied. "But I know this company. I know what it's actually worth once the dust settles. Robert never did. That was always the difference between us." Mr. Arthur took the napkin with the notes, folded it, and put it in his pocket. "I'm going to need a week to structure this properly," he said. "No direct tracks. Nothing that connects your name before the right time." Lucille nodded. "And I'm going to need," he continued with a slight smile under his glasses, "more coffee." In the weeks that followed, the plan took shape with the calculated slowness of things that must be invisible to work. Mr. Arthur bought small lots through a structure he knew well, distributed so they looked like different investors, opportunistic buyers sniffing out a cheap asset and moving in without fanfare. And while this was happening on the other side of town, Robert and Carla lived as if tomorrow were guaranteed. The mansion had gained an indoor pool that Lucille had refused years ago because she thought it was unnecessary. The closet that once belonged to Lucille had been demolished and expanded to house Carla's collection, with pieces arriving in boxes bearing names Lucille recognized from the advertisements in the magazines Maya flipped through during breaks. There were trips for dinners in other states, events that existed only to be photographed, an entire life built for the window display. While Lucille woke up at 5, took the bus to the shop, and set aside every dollar with the care of someone who knows every dollar is a stone in the path, Robert signed off on expenses with the ease of someone who believes the faucet will never run dry. On a Tuesday morning, when Lucille arrived at the shop and turned on her sewing machine, Mr. Arthur sent a short text, 3 words, 5%. She read it, put the phone on the bench, tucked the fabric under the needle, and began to sew. No one in the shop noticed she was smiling. The meeting was called with the urgency of someone drowning who thinks they've spotted the shore. Robert personally called every director, a rare occurrence, something he only did when the situation was too grave to delegate to an assistant. His voice had that specific quality of someone trying to sound controlled, but letting the weight of what they were carrying slip through the pauses between sentences. He said there was an interested investor, a big one, someone who had acquired a significant stake and wanted a formal meeting before any further movement. The directors showed up far too punctually, which meant every one of them had arrived early because every one of them knew, from the tone of that phone call, that something was wrong. The boardroom was the same as always. An oval, dark oak table, chairs upholstered in black leather, the glass wall facing the hallway with a view of the entire floor. Robert had ordered that glass wall installed years ago because he liked to be seen working. He liked it when employees passed by and saw him in important meetings, gesturing, presiding, existing with authority. Today, for the first time, he was on the wrong side of the glass. Carla was sitting to his right, as she had in so many meetings over the last couple of years, in a tailored blazer and the posture of someone who occupies space by choice. She had placed a pen on her notepad with the gesture of someone signaling they were ready, but her right leg, under the table, was bouncing at a rhythm she couldn't control. Their corporate lawyer was at the end of the table with the expression of someone who had already read the documents and had decided not to be the first to speak. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning. At 10:02, the door opened. The sound of heels was the first thing. That specific kind of heel that isn't loud but is firm, that doesn't seek attention but simply announces presence with the naturalness of someone who needs no announcement. The granite floor of the room captured every step clearly. Robert looked at the door, and his world stopped. Lucille entered with the step of someone who knew every inch of that hallway because she had walked it for decades. She had chosen the carpet for that hallway. She had argued with the architect about the width of that hallway when the office was being renovated, and Robert was away on a trip, and she had handled everything alone, as she always did. She wore a charcoal gray suit, precise, discreet, and undeniable all at once. Her hair, which had been left to its own devices during the difficult months, was now styled and structured with the care of someone who had decided that appearance was also a declaration. There was no exaggeration in anything. No flashy jewelry, no attempt to impress. It was just a woman who had decided at some point over the last few months to occupy her own full size. She was carrying a briefcase, brown leather, the same one. She sat at the head of the table, the chair that had always been Robert's, with the ease of someone sitting where they belong. She placed the briefcase in front of her, opened it without haste, pulled out a series of documents organized in dividers, and distributed them across the table with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the order, but didn't need to, because the order was obvious. No one in the room said a word. Robert's mouth was slightly open. The color had drained from his face with the speed that only happens when the shock is total, when the brain receives information for which it has no available category. He blinked. He looked at Carla. He looked back at Lucille, as if the alternating gazes could undo what he was seeing. Carla was rigid. The pen she had placed on the pad was now gripped between her fingers with a force that turned her knuckles white. "Good morning," Lucille said. Her voice was calm. That specific calm that isn't an absence of emotion, but emotion so well managed that it becomes a form of power. "I appreciate everyone being here." She looked at their lawyer at the end of the table. "I assume counsel has already had access to the updated shareholding structure. If not, the documents are right in front of you." The lawyer opened the folder without looking at Robert. "For those still processing," Lucille continued, in the same tone she would use for a routine staff meeting, "I represent 51% of the common shares of this company today. That puts me in the position of majority shareholder with the decisive vote on any corporate matter, including board composition, approval of balance sheets, and defining operational strategy." Robert found his voice. Came out raspy, far too small for the man who had always taken up so much sonic space in that room. "Lucille, how did you—" "I bought them," she said simply. "With what money?" His voice rose a pitch. "You had nothing. I know exactly what you had." She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with something far older than anger. "That is exactly what we need to talk about." She opened the second divider of the briefcase and pulled out a transparent plastic envelope, inside of which were documents that were clearly decades old. The edges yellowed with the specific color time gives to paper when it has been kept carefully, but hasn't been consulted in years. "When my mother died," she began, and her voice did not waver, "she left me an inheritance, a considerable one, from land her family had sold upstate in the 80s. Money that was deposited in an offshore account, structured by a lawyer she trusted." She paused. "Do you remember that conversation, Robert?" He didn't answer, but his silence was an answer. "You convinced me it was safer to keep that money outside the country, that there was economic instability, tax risks, and that the best thing was to leave it structured the way it was. You asked me to sign a series of documents that you said were for asset protection." She looked at him with a serenity that was, in that moment, the most devastating thing she could display. "And I signed them because I trusted you, because you were my husband." Robert was motionless. "What those documents actually did was transfer ownership of the account to your name, not as protection, as appropriation." She pushed a pile of copies across the table toward their lawyer. "The original documents are here. The original account, the transaction history, and the notary records proving that the signature, which was supposed to be an authorization on my part, was obtained through false information regarding the nature of the instrument I was signing." The word no one wanted to be the first to say was hanging over the table like smoke. Their lawyer spoke it softly, almost to himself. "Embezzlement, with the aggravating factor of a fiduciary relationship," Lucille confirmed, without looking at him, her eyes still on Robert. "My attorney filed the lawsuit last Thursday. You should have received the notice yesterday or this morning." Carla turned to Robert with a speed that discarded any composure she was still trying to maintain. "You told me this money was from the company," she said, her voice low but sharp enough for the whole room to hear. Robert didn't answer her either. There was something almost ironic about that moment. The woman who had helped destroy a marriage discovering, in the same room that the man she had done it for had built his own betrayal upon a previous one. As if cruelty always, at some point in the timeline, has a bill to pay. "My mother's inheritance," Lucille continued, putting the documents back into the envelope with the same care she had used to remove them, "is what allowed me to start the buybacks. The appraisal for the logistics warehouse that you never ordered completed what was missing as credit collateral." She closed the briefcase. "I didn't need much. I just needed patience, and to know this company better than anyone else in this room." She looked around. The directors were quiet, with the stillness of people doing silent math about their own professional futures. "To the board of directors," she said with a discreet nod to each side of the table, "nothing changes operationally today. There will be a transition meeting next week where I will present the restructuring plan. Each of you will receive a formal communication by tomorrow afternoon." She stood up. She picked up the briefcase, and she walked toward the door with the same firm steps as when she had entered, her heels marking the granite with a cadence that neither rushed nor dragged. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't turn around completely, just enough so that the profile of her face was visible to those still watching her. "Robert," she said. He looked up like a man lifting a heavy weight. "You said on the day you kicked me out that I didn't have the class to be the wife of a man of your status." A tiny pause. "You were right. I never had the class to be the wife of a man like you." And she left. The hallway was silent. Employees who were passing had stopped without realizing it, drawn by that specific quality of silence that radiates from inside a room when something irreversible has just happened. Lucille walked down the hallway she had chosen, over the carpet she had approved, past the reception desk where she had greeted employees for decades without anyone knowing exactly who she was. Now they knew. In the boardroom she had left behind, Robert sat in the chair that had been his for years, surrounded by documents he couldn't contest, and people who were already, each in their own way, calculating which way would be safest to look from now on. And Carla was looking at him with an expression he recognized. It was the same expression he had worn when he looked at Lucille before pushing her out the door. She didn't fire him. That was the part no one expected. The directors were waiting for an immediate sweep, that standard power shift move where the winner enters, the loser vanishes, and the hallway is cleared in one go. It was what made sense. It was what anyone else in her position would have done. Lucille wasn't anyone else. At the transition meeting the following week, when the restructuring plan was presented with the methodical clarity of someone who had spent months thinking through every detail, She reached the final item on the agenda and said, with the same calm voice as always, that Robert Miller would remain with the company. There was a silence that lasted 2 seconds longer than normal. She explained without drama that given the ongoing legal proceedings and the need to preserve assets for eventual restitution, it was in the new management's interest to keep the former partner employed and contributing, and that his new role had been defined in accordance with the skills he had actually demonstrated over the last few years. Attention to his own image, a willingness to circulate through the floors, and familiarity with the company's coffee. She folded the paper in front of her. As of Monday, Mr. Miller will report to the facilities supervisor. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the other silences that week. It was the silence of people processing something they understood perfectly and weren't sure if they were allowed to feel what they were feeling. Robert was sitting in the corner of the room, no longer at the head of the table, no longer with the posture of an owner, but with the contraction of someone trying to take up less space than their body naturally occupies. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the lawyer who was now paid by the company, and therefore by Lucille. The lawyer did not return the gaze. The uniform was delivered on Friday, navy blue, with the company logo embroidered on the chest, the same one that had been redesigned by an overpriced agency by Carla's decision, a project the new management had canceled in its first week. The name embroidered over the heart said simply, Robert. No last name, no title. Carla had been notified that same week, via a formal letter delivered by the legal department. Immediate termination for cause, detailing documented episodes of inappropriate conduct with employees, including the dinner incident witnessed by people whose names appeared on signed statements. A lawsuit for workplace harassment was filed alongside the notice, and Carla's name began appearing in court records that week, with the inevitability of things built on sand. She left without saying a word. But the floor security guard later reported, without being asked, that she stood in front of the elevator for nearly a minute before pressing the button. Robert learned the cleaning routes with the resignation of someone who has run out of arguments. He knew where the supply closet was, he knew what time the coffee needed to be ready. He knew which floors were serviced first in the morning. He moved through the hallways he had ordered built with the invisibility of someone wearing a uniform, and he discovered in that invisibility something that was perhaps the most precise punishment of all. People simply stopped looking. For years he had been seen. He had built an entire life around being noticed. And now he crossed the same hallways, past the same people, and their eyes slid right over him the way they slide over the furniture. Except for one Thursday afternoon, the private elevator, the one Robert had installed for his exclusive use when the company had grown enough for him to think he deserved a separate entrance, was open when he passed by with his cleaning cart. Lucille was inside, her back to him, talking to the new CFO about quarterly numbers. He stopped. She finished her sentence, made a note on her tablet, and then, with the natural movement of someone checking if the door was about to close, she looked out into the hallway. Their eyes met for a moment. She didn't say anything. There was no anger in that gaze, no explicit triumph, none of those emotions movies put on people's faces in moments like these. There was only the quiet recognition of someone seeing a situation and understanding it completely. The doors closed. The elevator went up. Robert stood in the hallway for a while with the cart beside him, then continued toward the supply closet with steps that had lost, at some point over the last few weeks, any trace of the cadence that had once called itself authority. The legal process lasted 18 months, not because it was complicated, but because the law takes the time it takes, and Lucille had learned better than most that haste is the most expensive mistake there is. She let every stage happen in the right order, with the right documents, with the lawyers she had chosen, with the care of someone choosing a foundation before a wall. The final settlement recognized the appropriation of the inheritance with 3 decades of interest. It recognized Lucille's contribution to the building of the corporate assets, and it established a restitution that, added to what she had already consolidated through the share buybacks, put her in a position that she herself took several days to look at, squarely without that specific vertigo of unexpected heights. She sold the company 6 months later. It wasn't a difficult decision. She had recovered what was hers and had proven what she needed to prove. Keeping the company wasn't the point. The point had never been the company. With part of the money, she created a foundation. She chose the name one afternoon on the porch of the sewing shop, with Maya by her side and Mr. Arthur drinking coffee in the wicker chair that had become his favorite spot in that yard. The foundation supported women who had been abandoned in old age, Women who had dedicated decades and had no paperwork to show for it. Women who woke up at 5 in the morning making coffee for someone who would one day leave with everything. Maya joined the foundation as a project coordinator, trading the shop for a small, noisy office she decorated with plants and photos and that youthful energy that insists on making an environment feel alive. Mr. Arthur continued as a financial consultant, with his tablet charts now dedicated to the foundation's portfolio, labeling folders with the same meticulousness as always, only now with a purpose that gave him a satisfaction he mentioned without being asked. And then Lucille bought the mansion back. The sale process had been initiated by Robert when the debts made it impossible to keep, well before the end of the legal case. She didn't rush. She waited for the right price, hired the same lawyer who had handled the inheritance documents, and signed the papers on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as if she were renewing a magazine subscription. She didn't move back in to live there. The renovations took 4 months. The heated pool became a physical therapy space. The 6 bedrooms became shared suites with accessible bathrooms and handrails on the walls. The expanded closet that once housed Carla's collection became an activity room with a TV, bookshelves, and a game table where afternoons passed with that good slowness of afternoons that are in no hurry to end. The backyard garden was the first thing she ordered restored. The tomatoes and basil returned to where they had always been. The rose bush, which had been ripped out during Carla's renovations, was replanted with a sapling Lucille fetched from a nursery across town on a Saturday morning, taking Maya with her. The two of them returning on the bus with the sapling wrapped in newspaper on Maya's lap, who complained about the weight but kept smiling. On an autumn afternoon, months after the grand opening, Lucille was on the porch with a cup of tea she had recently taken a liking to, influenced by one of the residents, a woman of 82 with firm opinions on the correct water temperature. When she heard footsteps on the sidewalk on the other side of the gate, she didn't pay attention immediately. There was street noise all the time now. That neighborhood hum the mansion used to filter out with its high walls, but which the shelter now let in freely, as if the place had learned to breathe differently. But something made her look up. Across the gate, on the sidewalk, an old man was pulling a recycling cart with both hands, the kind of cart that squeaks a little with every yard, made of an iron frame and mesh bottom. He was hunched over by weight or by habit, wearing clothes that were once good but which time and neglect had turned into something unrecognizable. He stopped in front of the gate. He looked at the mansion, at the porch, at the woman sitting there with a cup in her hand and rubber flip-flops on her feet. For a second that felt longer than it was. His eyes met hers. Lucille looked at him with the tranquility of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Then, with the natural gesture of someone simply continuing their afternoon, she turned her face slightly toward the table next to her, where 3 residents were finishing a card game with that noisy, friendly bickering of people who play every week and still don't agree on the rules. "Mrs. Gable," she said with a voice carrying genuine warmth, "that last card was perfectly legal." The 3 women laughed. One complained. The tea-drinking woman said something about the youth not knowing how to play rummy. And when Lucille looked back at the sidewalk, the man in the cart had already turned the corner. She took a sip of her tea. The temperature was perfect.